Hi everyone, here we go with another video. So, they say that the 12 cylinder is the last of its kind, and they usually lump that with the 599 and the F12 and the 812. But we can all agree, right, that the 599 is not actually the same as the others. Do we know what I was talking about? You may do. Maybe you did. Maybe you were this confused. And it's understandable if you were confused because I didn't introduce the topic. And so that is really the point of introductions, an introductory sentence, an introductory paragraph. You are likely confused because I had no introduction. I just went straight to my argument. And so I was talking about Ferraris, actually. So here I will just show you. This is the 599 that I was talking about. This is the F12, the 812, and this is the beautiful 12 cylinder that is currently in production. And so I was just saying that they are all in the same lineup. They're all GT cars. The 599 is the oldest. It is the first generation up until this VPO that is the fourth generation that's currently in production. Um, yeah, but I think it would have made a lot more sense if I just started off by saying, hey, you guys know about Ferraris, right? And then if I were to move on, I'd say like the 599, F12, 812, all of that stuff. Even if you didn't know much about Ferraris, you could kind of at least then um follow along and know that I am talking about different models of Ferraris and then just kind of try to piece together that way. And so that is what we want to think of when we consider introductions. You want to consider your audience when you decide what belongs in the intro and what can be left out of the intro. You want to think about what they know and what you would probably want to explain to them. And I wrote here that context will change the focus. So I had an argument there, right? That was my opinion. My opinion was most people lump the four cars together because they're all in the GT lineup. Um, but for me, they're not actually the same. I personally think the 599 is different from the rest. And so, what would that look like if I were to write this paper and let's say that I were to write this opinion piece and actually send it out. Okay, now if I were to write this for a, say, car magazine, right, I probably don't need to explain what the F12 is, or the 812, right? People who are into cars, really into cars, they will simply just know. Like I say 812, and then they'll just know, oh, you're talking about the super fast because the Ferrari 812 is the only one that is called an 812. And so that's generally how it works. Now, if I were to write this opinion piece and try to, as like maybe an op-ed for, say, The Sun or LA Times, right, or whatever it may be, like magazines or journals or newspapers, online or printed, that have a wider audience, then it's going to be very different because I cannot assume that the reader will actually know what I'm talking about. So I would need to actually explain a lot more that I would not need to explain in a car magazine. I would even need to explain, oh, what is a GT? What does that mean? I would not need to in a car magazine. In a one with a broader audience, I would need to say, oh, GT stands for Grand Touring, and this is what a Grand Touring means, right? And so there would be a lot more that would need to be explained in the introduction. And so it depends on the audience. And so that is why we really want to consider audience when we write, just in general. I mean, it works that way for our papers, but also just with whatever you're writing or whoever you're writing to, audience absolutely matters. Not understanding who your audience is, not anticipating who your audience may be, is going to cause problems in writing. And so it's always good to consider who your writing is being directed to. Now, the mindset of the introduction, this is what has been helpful for me as far as this is just my way of going about it. It's a suggestion. You don't have to do it the way that I do, but I have found that this works the easiest for me when it comes to brainstorming, when it comes to starting just drafting the intro and knowing what belongs and what doesn't. And so I imagine that I am talking with someone at a party, right? And so I'm talking to this person, we're exchanging, we're in conversation, they have their opinion, I have my own, we're chatting, right? And all of that stuff. And then a friend comes along, right? And then, they're like, "Oh my goodness, how are you?" And then I turn to them and I'm like, "Wow, I haven't seen you so long. How have you been?" And then, my friend, she goes, "Yeah, what are you guys talking about?" What would my answer be? Whatever is in that answer of mine, right? Whatever I need to explain or point out to bring my friend up to speed so that this conversation can be among three people now, that is the stuff that belongs in the intro. And so that's usually how I'm able to filter out what needs to be introduced, so that there's context, so that the main points are understood, and then what can be left for later in the body paragraphs. That is generally what I have found to be the easiest way to go about it. And again, you might have your own way, but I highly recommend you to consider finding a way that would be the most efficient for you. Because like I mentioned in the other video, we do not want to just sit there, watch a blank document, think about, how should I start? What do I actually need to put in an intro? Can I just state what I think? And as we just saw in the first minute of the video, that is not the case. It completely falls apart when I just randomly state what I think without providing any context. So that's the function of the intro. Now, the intro of intros is going to be the title. The title is going to be what introduces readers to everything that's going to be in the essay. And that's just what titles do. And that's just the function of the title, right? So please do not title your essays essay 1, 2, 3, 4, English essay, the title of whatever reading you have, dash essay, right? You want to have your title be the topic of your argument, the conversation. This is just for good practice, right? There is, because we're learning how to do academic writing, we're learning how to do scholarly writing, and there is no essay out there that has been peer reviewed, published, that says biology paper, chemistry research paper, right? It's not. It's the paper, the title is whatever the focus is on. And so it's the same idea here. You don't want to title it just simply essay 3, English paper 4, right? It's not good practice. Just don't do it. Now, it can be as simple as you want or as complicated as you want. You can be creative. I think titles are actually probably where you will have the most creative freedom in an academic paper. I've seen students been really witty with titles. Some of them are a bit humorous, a little sarcastic. Some of them have like a little play on words. So you can be creative if you like. It's not required. It can be just as simple and straightforward as you want as well. For example, the title, Shitty First Drafts. What was the paper about? It's about, hey, maybe you should consider writing shitty first drafts, right? It's pretty intuitive there. So the title, we don't need to rack our heads around it. You can, give as little thought as you want, but simply just do not title your essays this way. It's just not good practice. Okay, first sentences. I will say that first sentences, and this is something from a book from Stanley Fish, who is an English professor up at UC Berkeley. If you're interested in the reading, I will link it to you. Just let me know. The chapter itself is pretty lengthy, so I don't typically require for reading. But first sentences, Fish argues, have two components that are unique to first sentences. One is that first sentences must know everything else that comes after it. The first sentence is the only sentence in the entire essay in which that is required. And so typically what ends up happening is students find that it's actually easier to draft the body paragraphs and then go back and write the intro. Because the introduction is supposed to introduce the body of the paper. And if you know what your body is, then the intro becomes extremely easy. It's either that or you draft an intro, you write the bodies, and then you go back and edit the intro. But the intro is pretty much going to be the one that gets the most revision done because, I mean, unless you have like kind of an outline, like a really clear outline and you know exactly every single aspect of what needs to be said, the intro typically needs to be tweaked the most. Um, yeah, and so that is the first component, is that sentences must know everything else that comes, the first sentence must know everything else that comes after. Second thing is what Fish calls the angle of lean. And so he says that first sentences lean the reader into everything else that comes after. And so the best first sentence are the ones that's able to situate the reader in a way that eases them into the conversation um, the most efficiently. And so when we think about what actually makes a good first sentence, what is the purpose of a first sentence, those are typically the two things that first sentences must do. They must lean readers into everything else that's going to be in the paper. And in order to do so, it must know every sentence that comes after it to be able to understand how to guide the reader into the conversation. And so possible ways to start an essay, this is a very short list, a very short list. You can start with definition, historical fact. Depending on the type of paper you're writing, philosophical idea might also work. If you're writing a paper that includes multiple readings, or is joining a conversation that is extremely, like one that's just been around for a while, you might incorporate other writers or readings that are relevant to the topic. Or you might want to start with a brief summary of what the reading is about. But the general takeaway that I want us to get here is that you want to go from general information to specific information. General information is anything that establishes foundational info for the reader. And so for my example in the first minute of the video, the general information would have been Ferraris. And then the specifics would be my actual argument, right? And then we go into the body paragraph where I expand on my reasoning and my logic and all of the data and the points that I want to make so that I can persuade you to agree with me. And so that's the idea that you want to think about when you think about organizing information and how to situate the introduction in a way that helps the reader forward into everything else that's going to follow. Now, in your intro, you're going to have a thesis statement. Reading analysis, that is pretty much going to be our first paper and our midterm. And so this is going to be the way the thesis statement is going to be for early on in the semester. Now, thesis statements can vary, which is why I have on here sometimes can also state. But this is what we're starting with. The thesis statement must state the author name, the title being analyzed, and the focus in the body of the paper. Now, it doesn't have to be in this order, but we want to make sure that we have all three components in one sentence. Please do not have the thesis statement more than one sentence. There will be a time where you will have thesis statements plural within a paper and you'll have multiple sentences. At that point, you're writing papers that are like 20, 30, 40 pages long, in which you will just need a more sentences just because you have so much that you actually need to say. That is not the case here in this class. So we will need to have thesis statements that are one sentence. I will not accept thesis statements that are more than one sentence long. We simply just do not need it. you have excess information if your thesis statement is that long. Now, thesis statements can also sometimes state the publication year. That depends on the class you're taking. Some essays, depending on the topic, will want publication year. If you're writing a scientific paper or a psychology paper, those typically want publication year because the year helps the reader determine the relevancy, or the how current the research is. And then sometimes I'll state a counter argument. This is what we'll be practicing later on in the semester, but this, for now, I just want you to know that I mention these now so that you understand that thesis statements can take a variety of forms depending on the type of paper you're writing. It's just that for this first couple papers, you want these three components, especially for essay 1, where we're talking about rhetoric and defining rhetoric. So some examples here. First one that we have here, I'm just going to move myself up. The thesis statement for A has all three components in one sentence. Of the more popular fairy tales by the Grimm brothers, Rapunzel is arguably the one with the most symbolism overlooked by readers young and old alike. Okay, so we have one sentence, three components. We have the author, the Grimm brothers, the title, Rapunzel, and then the focus of the paper. I know from this one sentence that the rest of the body of the essay is going to focus on symbolism that we can find in Rapunzel that most people don't see regardless of their age. That's pretty much what the sentence tells me. And that's all we need. That is the purpose of the thesis statement. Second sentence does the same thing, so you can study that on your own. The third sentence example that I have here is for if you write a thesis statement in which you need to compare or include two works. And this is mainly for your reference so that you understand it's one of those writing rules as well. If you write a sentence in which you have multiple authors and multiple titles, you need to have the list order match. They need to be respective of each other, is typically how we say it. And that is just so that your paper does not need to say, oh, this person wrote this and this person wrote this. It's insinuated simply by the order. So it saves time for you as a writer, and it also saves time for readers because we don't need to know that. We can just assume from the order what's going on, and you can just state your opinion and move on with your ideas and the things you actually need to say. And so here from this sentence, this third example that I have here, we can assume just simply from the order that Susan Sontag wrote on photography and that Neil Postman wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death. That is given because of the order in the sentence. And so that's just something to be aware of. You want to make sure that you practice the same way as a writer. And that's really just the takeaway here. That's just for your reference. But these are some sample thesis statements to show you how it's possible to just summarize a whole paper in one sentence. And that is one of the skills that we really want to practice and get. And yeah, one of the skills that we want to acquire by this semester. Yeah. And so let's just get started with trying some.